Right, there we are. Gosh, I can't believe this is the final one. Thank you, everybody who has come along with me for any part of this ride. I've had an absolute ball. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel. I'm a sci-fi author and creative writing mentor, and I am going to talk to you today about what is, to my mind, one of spec-fic's greatest superpowers, and that's its ability to hold up a mirror to our present-day society. So, I want to spend a wee bit of time unpacking what we mean by allegory and why it's useful, how it intersects with things like theme, how that intersection happens, and then we'll have a look at some of the things to consider as you start to weave your own allegorical tale. Excuse me. We'll look at some of the key components that you'll want to deploy, some of the literary devices that authors can use to create allegorical stories, that sort of thing. So, if that sounds good, let's get started. Okay, so just to kick us off, make sure we're all on the same page, here's a quick definition of allegory. Allegory is a literary device in which characters, events, and details symbolize deeper meanings or abstract ideas, allowing the story to convey moral, political, or philosophical messages beyond its literal interpretation. Bit of a mouthful, but what that effectively means is that you're using a visible narrative to tell a different, invisible, and often more loaded story. Of course, probably the most famous example is The Crucible by Arthur Miller, which of course was written during the height of the McCarthy hearings when the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, they were actively seeking out evidence of communist infiltration of the arts, and in particular the Hollywood film industry at the time, so that's 1950s-ish. So of course, this is a time when being critical as an artist of what's going on in the hearings was quite likely to end a person's career. But Arthur Miller is horrified by what he's seeing, so he writes this allegorical tale critiquing the McCarthy hearings, and not too subtly either. And he does this allegorical. He compares them allegorically to the Salem witch trials. When I say not too subtly, and what I mean by that is he was in fact subpoenaed later to testify in the hearings a few years after the play opened, and the play itself was probably a big factor in why he was subpoenaed to testify. Everyone was clear that it was an allegorical tale, is the point. But what makes it allegorical specifically is the fact that the story of the Salem witch trials, as it appears in The Crucible, it's entirely possible to read this on a surface level as a story about the Salem witch trials. It's a self-contained narrative that functions perfectly well if you have zero contextual knowledge about the play. And it is actually just a really compelling story entirely in its own right. So it functions as a story about the Salem witch trials, but it also functions as an allegory about McCarthyism. And I think this is probably a good place to talk about the concept of mythic space, because it's kind of critical to the way allegory performs in The Crucible, and it's an important component of allegory in general. So I'm going to give you an absolute mouthful here. I am going to unpack this, don't worry. So mythic space is a narrative environment that transcends its physical attributes to embody deeper symbolic meanings and universal themes. By linking the story space to symbolic meanings, mythic space allows parallel narratives to run concurrently to explore broader societal issues. I know that's a mouthful. Okay, let's unpack it. So what this means is the world in which your allegorical tale takes place, whether it's here on Earth or in a galaxy far, far away, or indeed in 17th century Massachusetts, it can be a real place, it can be a speculative place, but for the purposes of telling your allegorical story, the space that appears in the story becomes one big bucket of symbols, basically. It's a place, it's a setting, it's the world that you're building, it's a location. But as it exists in your story, it's now taken on a whole other invisible layer of meaning. So basically, the space, the location, the setting, it's become a symbol of some overarching theme that you want to explore. It's probably easier to understand this with an example. So let us move on to District 9. I wonder how many people have seen District 9. Okay, so nobody ever accused Neil Blomkamp of subtlety in his allegories, but that's one of the reasons why this is such a useful example. So for anybody who hasn't seen the movie, and it is something like 15 years old now, unbelievably. I don't even know how that happened. But anyway, it's set in an alternate reality of present day real life Johannesburg. So already we're looking at a space that's both a real space and a constructed space. So present day Johannesburg is obviously a space that exists in our world. But this present day Johannesburg is also constructed in that, aliens obviously didn't actually land in Johannesburg in 1982 as per this version of Johannesburg. But anyway, in this alternate history, aliens arrive in Johannesburg in 1982 and they are obviously in need of help because they're ill and they're malnourished. So this is not an alien invasion story. This is a story about refugees ultimately. And the government at the time makes a big show of taking them in, giving them safe harbour, and they're relocated to a camp called District 9. And by the time the narrative proper takes place, this is in 2009, District 9 has become a slum, basically. So the aliens living there are in abject poverty. They are despised by the locals. They're called derogatory names. The humans call the aliens prawns. And the city itself has become now zoned for humans and non-humans, and the aliens can't be in the human zones. So, I mean, when I say it's not subtle, what I mean, I guess, is that Neil Blomkamp is pulling no punches with his story here. He wants this to be super visible, a bit like The Crucible. It's allegorical, but it leaves you in absolutely no doubt about what that invisible allegorical narrative might be. But there is a visible narrative. It's all about this main human character played by Charlton Copley. I got his name right. I hope I've got his name right. Anyway, he plays the main human character. He accidentally sprays himself with this kind of chemical that starts to slowly reorganize his genetic material so that he's gradually turning into one of the aliens. And the story we're following is we're basically focusing on his efforts to A, not turn into an alien, and B, escape from the evil humans who now want to harvest all his bits to weaponize him. And of course, it turns out to be the aliens who help this human protagonist escape, while the humans now see him as a commodity to be used and sort of abused and brutalized for financial gain. So there is a narrative. And I mean, you're absolutely welcome to watch this movie as a narrative about this kind of mild-mannered, bumbling, Nepo baby human who accidentally aliens himself and then has to escape the clutches of the evil government forces before they can turn him into soup. You know, it's a narrative that stands on its own 2 feet by itself, and it can, if you want to, though I don't know why you would, but you can absolutely watch this movie divorced from its allegorical context. But I mean, why would you want to? That's a fairly insubstantial narrative, not terribly new, not terribly exciting. You know, it's fine, it works. It's a bit silly, but it works well enough. But when a creator so clearly wants you to read their narrative allegorically, it really is the only way to get the full experience. And the allegorical nature is what lifts this narrative up from that slightly silly premise. So mythic space, circling back to mythic space. In this movie, it's working as follows. You have a location, Johannesburg. You have a time period, 2009. It's a real location. It's a contemporary time period, or at least it was when the movie was released. But this is also not the real Johannesburg. You know, in 2009. It's quite clearly, for one thing, an alternative Johannesburg, because we all know perfectly well that aliens landing there in 1982 is not something that actually happened, but it's also part of an allegorical narrative. So we sort of circle back to this definition of allegory. It's a literary device in which characters, events, and details symbolize deeper meanings or abstract ideas, allowing the story to convey moral, philosophical, or political messages beyond its literal interpretation. Mythic space is a narrative environment that transcends its physical attributes to embody deeper symbolic meanings and universal themes. So what that means in practice is that the places that appear in this kind of allegorical story, no matter that they may well be real places, they are all fulfilling some kind of deeper symbolic purpose. So the whole story world effectively is being kind of co-opted into this symbolism, this kind of parallel narrative, the invisible narrative that supports and makes sense of the visible narrative. The whole story world exists as a space to allow this symbolic narrative to play out, with different elements of the story world symbolically connected to the deeper invisible narrative. And this circles us right back to the idea of world building. Because this allegorical idea of mythic space, it is absolutely fundamentally connected to the very bones of the world that you're building. So without the world building, without you having kind of a deep, fundamental understanding of the intricacies of how your world operates, you can't really start to link these intricacies symbolically to your allegorical narrative. So I have said the word symbolically a lot here, and I'm conscious that I haven't, actually explained what I mean by that. And I'm also conscious that there's more than just symbolism involved in mobilizing your world building into telling an allegorical story. So let's just take a minute to have a look at the various different literary devices that we can deploy in an allegorical tale. Okay, now allegory itself is a type of literary device. I'm not going to cover it off again here. I'd be repeating myself a bit. I'm going to look at the other different types of literary devices that can support you in constructing this allegorical tale of yours. And all of these flow from world building, by the way. Quick word about theme first, because theme is obviously absolutely critical to your allegorical world, but it's not a narrative device. Theme it's a literary element. So a literary device is a specific tool or technique used by creators to tell a story. A literary element is a component. So literary components include the big building blocks of your story, like theme, but like character also, like setting, like plot, and sort of that sort of thing. Each of these elements contributes to the overall meaning and structure of the narrative, whereas literary devices are tools and techniques that you use in service of telling your narrative. But your theme, of course, is the central message you're trying to convey with your allegorical tale. So it's the foundational idea, it's the concept that you want your allegorical story to discuss. So in District 9, for example, it's discussing themes like xenophobia, like racism. It's looking at how humans have a tendency to dehumanize the other. Literally any difference that marks us out as us versus them. We've historically had a bad habit of using that as a rationale for treating the other in some truly horrific ways at some times and places. And of course, South Africa is a country with, the grim history of apartheid, in which humans were literally segregated and treated as less than human because they were other than the people in power. And District 9 is discussing that through allegory, and that allegory is supported by various different literary devices. So let's start with symbolism, because this is the one I've been banging on about. So symbolism can be defined as a literary device in which a character, object, or event represents deeper meanings or abstract ideas beyond its literal sense. Now, we live in a world of symbols. We have this whole system of like squiggly lines that we've developed to symbolically represent abstract ideas like numbers or sounds or even objects, language, our numbering system, these are all symbols. We've kind of all just collectively decided that these symbols have meanings that we've all agreed upon. And we've normalized this symbolism behind our numbers and our alphabets and our language systems to a place where the symbolism is now completely invisible. We don't think about it as being symbolic, but it's entirely symbolic and it's entirely constructed. But, in a narrative sense, symbolism is a really powerful technique for making one object tell two stories. So the literal story and then the deeper symbolic story. So in District 9, for example, you have the aliens symbolizing at a broader level marginalized groups in society. And more specifically, they symbolize Black South African people under apartheid. And you have the big bad government agency symbolizing corporate greed and exploitation. And you actually have the protagonist's transformational journey from human to alien. So the more alien he becomes, the more empathy and compassion and understanding he shows, which is symbolizing the fact that the basic humanity of the other is often completely overlooked in segregated societies. So that's District 9. So how do you use that symbolism in your own constructed world, though, the world that you're using to tell your allegorical tale? Well, a couple of examples. It's quite literally, this is almost an infinite possibility here. But a couple of examples. Maybe you have a particular type of plant that only flowers under specific conditions. That then you can mobilize that to become a symbol of hope if you need it to. Hope or whatever you kind of symbolically attach to it. But let's say you're symbolically using it as a symbol of hope. It doesn't literally matter what conditions the flower needs in order to flower. In your mythic space, everything can have a parallel meaning attached to it. The literal meaning becomes kind of less important than the symbolic meaning. Tech's another big one, specifically intelligent technology. Personally, I'm not sure I've ever knowingly written a story about intelligent tech that wasn't somehow symbolizing our struggle to understand what makes us human. There's a lot of possibility there. Or, you could keep it classic. You could go for the symbolism of color. So color in our real world is absolutely shot through with symbolism. If you think about it, why do we stop at a red light? Because red symbolizes stop. Why does it symbolize stop? Because we've all decided it did. And we've all kind of communicated that and everybody gets it. Why do we talk about, for example, the Monday blues? because blue symbolizes sadness or despondency. And you can absolutely go for these very classical color symbolism associations, or you can create your own entirely new palette of meaning that's specific to your world. Once you've got some of your symbolism in mind, you can start thinking about motifs. So a motif is a recurring element or idea that helps to develop and reinforce the overall message or concept of the narrative. And some of the ways a motif can manifest are through symbols, phrases, maybe concepts that appear multiple times throughout the text. You can really have a lot of fun with this. Again, the possibilities are almost limitless. Now, a motif can be a symbol and a symbol can be a motif, but they're not one and the same thing. A symbol typically represents a single idea, but a motif can manifest in various forms throughout the story. It's about patterns, ultimately. A motif recurs in a way that creates patterns that enhance the reader's understanding of the text. Again, probably best to talk about this with an example. So a very famous example of a literary motif. This is not spec-fic, but I'm using it because it's a great, very famous example of how symbolism and motif often intertwine. So The Great Gatsby, I'm using it because it's so famous. So if you've heard this before, apologies. It's, it's for illustration only, as they say. So in The Great Gatsby, if you don't know, the green light is a literal feature in the novel. It's a light that's at the end of the dock on Daisy and Tom's property. But its use in the text makes it clear that the green light is also a symbol, and it's a symbol of Gatsby's unattainable love for Daisy. So then in a wider sense, it becomes a symbol of the sense of longing in general. And the novel, The Great Gatsby, is a novel. It's a critique of the American dream. So Gatsby's longing for Daisy is in a wider sense broadly symbolic of the longing for a kind of idea of better that the American dream represents. So the green light is an example of symbolism, but because it recurs strategically throughout the novel, and each time it's being symbolically linked to the same idea of longing and yearning for something unattainable, the repetition means that the green light now becomes a motif as well. So again, to bring this back to your own allegorical world that you're building. Okay, so let's circle back to this flower that only blooms in certain conditions and how that's a symbol of hope or resilience. So the first time a character encounters or mentions this flower and the text assigns a symbolic meaning of hope to that flower, that's when the flower becomes symbolic in your narrative. It's a symbol now. But the next time that flower is mentioned, the time after that, the time after that, now it's become a motif. It's a symbol, but it's also a motif. Or, maybe you're using color, like I was saying, under symbolism. So again, if you think back to last week's discussion about weaving world building into narrative, I talked about a society that only wears reds and yellows for lots of very sort of grounded world building reasons. But anyone wearing blues and purples in that society is automatically labeled as an outsider because that society doesn't wear blues or purples. So already you've got a symbolic use of color. But maybe now, if you're reds and yellows world, maybe if it's oppressive in some way, now you've got purples and blues potentially standing out as a symbol of freedom from oppression, or maybe rebellion, or again, hope, perhaps. Maybe that color association moves beyond specifically clothes. Maybe it becomes also purple flowers are used as a symbol of freedom from oppression, or somebody looks longingly at the last few colors of the rainbow, something like that. And now you've got purple and blue acting as a motif in your narrative world. And I mean, beyond this, I've looked at symbolism and motif. There are so many tools at your disposal here. I haven't even talked about metaphor, where you're directly comparing one thing to another to create new meaning. Metaphor is at the heart of symbolism. Symbolism confers meaning through metaphorical associations. So it's actively encouraging you to read objects and events as if they represent some wider abstract idea. That's what metaphor does. There's a lot of overlap between metaphor and symbolism. You could also look at things like personification. It's possibly a little bit less common these days. I think maybe there's a danger of feeling maybe cutesy or Disney-esque potentially. But one of the most famous allegories in modern literary history is crafted almost entirely from personification, the animals of Animal Farm. So when Orwell turns the pigs into the new oppressors, he really could not be making his point any more clearly here, though I quite like pigs and I don't think he's been at all fair to them. Okay, so I don't have an exercise for this session per se, but I do want to leave you with some questions you can ask yourself. These kind of tie up everything we've been looking at over the past few weeks, but they are designed to specifically help guide your thinking as you flesh out your world building and start to look at actively putting it into service in your novel, and whether or not you're actively setting out to tell an allegorical tale. These will all help you introduce layers of meaning into your story. So first up, oops, what is the core theme or message I want to explore? So, foundational question here. You may not be able to articulate this at an early stage of your writing process, and that's absolutely fine. You may choose to articulate it when you've completed your first draft to help guide your revisions. You may never articulate it. You may only discover that you've incorporated this deeper theme when somebody congratulates you for how clever you've been after the book is published. That has happened to me. And my advice is, if that happens to you, always accept the compliment if somebody tells you that you're being cleverer than you thought you were being, by the way. Anyway, but if you know going in that you want to write an allegorical story, then you do need to spend a bit of time working out what ultimately will be the core theme or message that the story will be exploring. The personality of your setting. So if anybody remembers session 2, we were talking about the vibrance, the irreverent humor of the Discworld, which allows Pratchett, especially in later books, absolutely skewer some of humanity's worst bits by kind of exposing the fundamental absurdity of them. Or perhaps, we talked about then as well about the kind of the nostalgia, the complexity of the Lord of the Rings. I know Tolkien was very clear that the Lord of the Rings was specifically not an allegory, but I feel like we can kind of count it as like an accidental allegory. It's absolutely valid to read this as an allegory for the horrors of the World War, and for yearning for a simpler, quieter time of peace before, darkness tried to take over the world, whether or not he actively meant to do that. Okay, so what elements of my settings, population, power structures, geography, environment, etc., etc. This is when you start looking at the symbolism you've already got available to you from your 3Ps world building. And then finally, how can I introduce symbols that enrich the narrative without overwhelming it? So this is where you look at how the world you've built can lend itself to symbolism. Generally speaking, and I know we've talked about some very heavy-handed examples of symbolism in District 9, Animal Farm, The Crucible, and so on, you don't, generally speaking, want to go heavy-handed. People don't like to feel as though they're being preached to when they're reading a story, especially if it's a story that's available in multiple layers. Ultimately, we want to craft a story that can stand on its own 2 feet. We want to craft a story that can be read entirely at face value if somebody chooses to do that. The story itself has to be compelling. It has to have a beginning, middle, and an end. It has to show development, progression, character arc, narrative arc, and that sort of thing. But introducing these symbols that enrich the narrative, that's when you start to provide an extra layer of meaning. And this is when you're writing for the more engaged reader and rewarding the more engaged reader, because it's in that extra layer of meaning that we find a narrative's beating heart. So I know that's a lot to cover. It's a big topic for a short session, but I hope that gives you some ideas of what's involved and how to get started. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I know it was another whistle-stop tour, so if I can explain anything in further detail or answer any other questions, I'll be delighted to do that. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. Are there any themes that you've struggled to represent, Brona? I think that's a great question. There are many, many themes that I would really like to unpack and to look at. And I'm not sure that I am the person to do them justice. I think that particularly in this kind of literary moment, there is a lot of focus on own voice stories. And a lot of those are telling allegorical tales about kind of the deeper reality of being a marginalized voice in our present day society in general. And while, I can speak for a couple of marginalized voices, I can by no means speak for all of them or even most of them. And those are themes that I think, rather than struggle to represent them, that's not really my story to tell, I think. And that's why I think struggle. I would really like to give my thoughts on these things, but I don't think it's my thoughts that are the most relevant here, if that makes sense. Do you think you can have a phrase as a motif? Make my day. Ah, that's a great one. So, um, kind of, yes. In order for it to be a motif, it has to convey some kind of deeper significance. Um, so it has to kind of redirect the audience back. So potentially, Yes, if it changes or if it's available to multiple levels of understanding, I think make my day. I haven't seen enough Clint Eastwood movies. I will put my hand up and confess to say, does it have any deeper meaning attached to it? I honestly couldn't tell you. I think my instinct there is that it's more of a catchphrase than a motif, but it is certainly possible for things that people say to be used. What am I thinking of? Winter is coming, for example. Um, I think there's deeper symbolism attached to that in the Game of Thrones series because it's not just your winter is coming. It's not the literal meaning that's being conveyed a lot of the time when people say winter is coming. They're talking about winter in a metaphorical sense as well as a literal sense. So I think it is possible. I don't think that's the one I would use, and I'm sure there are better examples than that. But of course, my squirrel brain's not going to let me access them just on the fly like this. Um, Thank you so much, Annie. That's really kind of you to say. I really appreciate your kind words. Thank you. How to write sci-fi book. Goodness. I mean, I've thought about it, Haley. Thank you for that. I have thought about it. And I may do it. I don't know. I just need an extra 24 hours in every day, or perhaps an extra 7 days in every week in order to actually sit down and do it. But thank you. That's very kind of you. Oh, thank you, Mara. That's very kind of you. If there's no further questions, then I just want to say thank you so much to everybody for you've been really engaged and you've asked great questions and you have listened to me ramble on about some of my most favorite things in the entire world, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.